On a dark patch of Iranian desert, a U.S. rescue force had just called off a secret mission to save 53 American hostages. Then, as the force tried to leave, one of its helicopters began repositioning beside a C-130, loaded with men and fuel. In the dust, the two aircraft collided. The desert exploded into fire, and the Americans had not even reached Tehran. 5.5 months of planning were collapsing at the mission's first stop. How could a rescue operation involving elite troops, 6 transport aircraft, 8 helicopters, intelligence teams, and direct presidential approval unravel before the rescuers ever saw the embassy? To understand that, go back to November 4, 1979. Iranian militants seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took dozens of Americans hostage. 13 were released within weeks, but by the spring of 1980, 53 Americans were still in Iranian custody. The crisis became a daily wound for the United States. Their faces appeared on television. Families waited. Diplomats negotiated. President Jimmy Carter tried economic pressure and diplomacy. But month after month, the hostages stayed where they were. Eventually, the White House approved something far more dangerous: go into Iran and take them back. The problem was that Tehran was not a target the United States could simply reach from a nearby friendly base. The embassy sat deep inside a hostile country, hundreds of miles from the sea. The rescuers had to enter Iran without warning, move a large assault force close to the capital, hide it through daylight, drive into Tehran, storm the embassy, collect the hostages, escape the city, reach helicopters, fly to an airfield captured by Army Rangers, and then board transport aircraft for the final flight out. Every stage had to connect to the next, and in 1980, the U.S. military did not have one permanent Special Operations Command built to make all of those pieces work together. So planners assembled the mission from different services and different machines. 3 Air Force MC-130s would carry a 118-man assault force into Iran. 3 more EC-130s would carry fuel. 8 Navy RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters would launch from the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz and fly nearly 600 nautical miles at night and low altitude to a remote desert landing area about 200 miles southeast of Tehran. That place was codenamed Desert 1. At Desert 1, the helicopters would refuel from the C-130s, take the assault force aboard, and fly them to another hide site roughly 65 miles from Tehran. The men would remain concealed during the day. The next night, trusted drivers and agents would take them into the city. After the embassy assault, the helicopters would pick up the rescuers and hostages and carry them south to Mansourieh airfield. Rangers were supposed to seize that runway. C-141 transports would then land, load everyone, and fly them out of Iran. On paper, it was a chain. In reality, every link created another place where the entire operation could fail. The Americans tried to reduce that risk. Weeks before the mission, Air Force Combat Controller Major John Carney secretly entered Iran and surveyed Desert 1. He helped confirm that C-130s could use the surface and placed infrared lights and strobes that would guide the incoming aircraft at night. The site was isolated, but not completely empty. A road crossed the area, and planners understood that passing vehicles might appear. They believed they could control that problem long enough to keep the mission secret. By April, after months of rehearsals, the force was ready. President Carter approved the operation. On the evening of April 24, 1980, the mission began. The 6 C-130s headed toward Desert 1 from Masira Island near Oman. Far away, 8 Sea Stallions lifted from the deck of the Nimitz and started the long flight into Iran. The helicopters had the harder route. They had to stay low, fly in darkness, avoid detection, and reach Desert 1 with enough time left to refuel and continue before daylight. About 2 hours after takeoff, the first helicopter problem appeared. Helicopter number 6 received cockpit indications of a possible rotor blade failure. The crew landed in the desert, confirmed that the malfunction required an abort, and abandoned the aircraft. Another helicopter picked up the crew and continued. The mission had started with 8 helicopters. Now it had 7. That still looked survivable. Then the helicopters encountered suspended dust. They emerged from one area and later entered another cloud that was larger and denser. Visibility collapsed. Inside that dust, Helicopter number 5 lost several critical navigation and flight instruments. Its pilot decided that continuing was no longer safe. He turned around and flew back toward the Nimitz. Now only 6 helicopters were still heading toward Desert 1. 6 was not comfortable. 6 was the minimum the planners had decided they needed to continue the rescue. The mission had used up its entire helicopter reserve before the force even reached the first landing zone. And there was a cruel detail the pilot of number 5 did not know. The worst dust ended farther ahead, and conditions at Desert 1 were good enough to fly. A lead C-130 had information about the weather, but the helicopter force was operating under strict radio silence procedures designed to protect the mission from detection. The official review later concluded that, with that information, number 5 might have continued. The rule meant to preserve secrecy may have helped remove the helicopter that could have kept the mission alive. And one of the 6 helicopters still moving toward Desert 1 was already carrying another problem. Helicopter number 2 had suffered a partial hydraulic failure. Its crew kept going because they believed it might be repairable at the rendezvous. While the helicopters fought their way through the dust, the first C-130s reached the desert site. Almost immediately, the supposedly remote staging area became crowded with problems. A passenger bus drove toward the Americans on the road crossing the landing zone. The rescue force stopped it and detained the people aboard. Then a fuel truck came down the same road and failed to stop. An American fired a light anti-tank weapon at it. The truck erupted in flames, turning part of the dark desert into a giant beacon. The driver escaped in a pickup truck. The mission had been designed around secrecy. At Desert 1, before the helicopters had even arrived, the Americans had stopped a bus full of civilians, set a truck on fire, and watched a vehicle disappear into the night. Still, the commanders chose to continue. The C-130s were in place. The assault force was ready. If 6 helicopters arrived and remained usable, the mission could move forward. But Desert 1 itself was becoming harder to manage. The full scene had never been rehearsed at this scale. The final validation exercise had used only 2 C-130s and 4 helicopters. Now multiple large transports, arriving helicopters, troops, fuel hoses, road security teams, and moving crews were packed into darkness and blowing dust. Noise made communication difficult. People moving between aircraft were hard to identify. There was no simple, quiet command post sitting above the confusion. The mission was still functioning, but its first rendezvous was already more complicated than the rehearsal that had tested it. Eventually, 6 Sea Stallions did reach Desert 1, but they came in between roughly 50 and 85 minutes late. The dust had already consumed most of the schedule. Then the crew of helicopter number 2 reported the hydraulic problem it had carried into the landing zone. The helicopter could not safely continue without repair. A pump had failed because of a fluid leak. There was no replacement pump available, and even if there had been one, there was not enough darkness left to repair the system and complete the next leg before sunrise. One helicopter had been abandoned in the desert. Another had turned back to the carrier. A third had made it all the way to Desert 1 and was now unusable. The force had 5 working helicopters. The plan required 6. There was no clever workaround left. The assault force, the hostage load, the distances, and the fuel calculations had all been built around that minimum. The commander at Desert 1 reported the situation up the chain. President Carter agreed with the decision. Operation Eagle Claw was aborted. That should have been the end of the story. A humiliating failure, but one in which the Americans simply turned around and went home. Instead, canceling the rescue created one last operation inside the operation. The assault force had to be loaded back onto the C-130s. The helicopters needed fuel for the long return to the carrier. Aircraft had to move around one another on a dark desert floor, already churned by engines and rotor wash. The clock was still running. Fuel aboard the C-130s was not unlimited. Every extra minute on the ground made the withdrawal harder, and the same secrecy that had shaped the mission meant Desert 1 was not a brightly lit airbase, with normal taxiways, controllers, and familiar crews. It was an improvised refueling point inside Iran. While one helicopter was repositioning so another could top off its tanks for the return flight, it collided with a fuel-laden EC-130. Both aircraft were engulfed in fire. 5 Air Force crewmen aboard the C-130 and 3 Marines aboard the helicopter were killed. Several other Americans were injured. The C-130 also held members of the rescue force. And more men escaped, only because they got out of the burning aircraft quickly. Then ammunition inside the wreckage began exploding. Fragments struck other helicopters. Fuel and time were running out. The commanders stopped trying to recover the remaining helicopters. Crews climbed onto the surviving C-130s and left Iran, abandoning aircraft and equipment in the desert. The secret rescue mission was now impossible to hide. Iranian television showed the burned wreckage at Desert 1 to the world. Carter publicly accepted responsibility. Secretary of State Cyrus Vance, who had opposed the operation, resigned. Richard Queen was released for medical reasons in July, but the other 52 hostages did not leave Iran until January 20, 1981, after 444 days of captivity. Desert 1 also became a catalyst for changing American special operations. The failure exposed how dangerous it was to assemble different services, aircraft, command systems, and training cultures only when a crisis appeared. The Army soon built a dedicated Special Operations Aviation capability that became the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Broader reforms eventually created U.S. Special Operations Command in 1987. Eagle Claw was not the only reason those organizations emerged, but it became one of the failures they were designed not to repeat. The rescue force never reached the hostages. It never reached Tehran. It never made it past the first refueling stop. Yet the disaster in that empty Iranian desert helped reshape the force America would send the next time a mission like this could not afford to fall apart.